I completed my PhD in 3 years and you can too. So why 3 years? Why not 2 years? Why not 1 year? And I think it really comes down to the fact that a PhD is a journey and it takes about 3 years because firstly, you need to get used to your research, you need to get used to your field, you need to get used to your supervisor, you need to get used to all of these things, you need to build the skills. Then you need to fail a lot. And that is one thing I think that we are all not very good at, is failing so that we can kind of find the things that work. And we're going to talk about some very important principles throughout this video for making sure that you are able to finish within 3 years and that you use your time effectively. And then also the last year allows you to sort of like rapidly build on what you've learned, do those experiments that no one else has done, and then write up as you go along. You know, there are kind of gradients. It's not like throughout a PhD you stop doing one thing and you go on to the next. There's kind of overlap, and those overlaps are really about managing your time effectively so that you can balance, you know, going from very hardcore experimental if you're in the sciences, or very hardcore like research if you're doing any other sort of PhD, and then fading that across into doing the writing up, which ultimately is the thing that will get you your PhD. Still, theses are the way people are finishing up a PhD. You can do a PhD by publication, but I've not known too many people to do that, even today. So a thesis is going to be the thing that decides whether or not you get your PhD. It has to be full of new information, it has to be rigorous, and it has to be novel. And so that's what you're aiming for. And you've got to start your PhD with that goal in mind. You are creating novel research. You have to do something that no one else has done before. You're contributing to a field in a unique way that no one else has done before. And that can be challenging, but there are tiny steps to get there, and we'll talk about those in this video. So why 3 years? Just because you need to fail a load of times and you need a buffer so that you can pick up on the things that are working and run with it. All right, so here are the sort of absolute steps that I would take if I was trying to complete a PhD in 3 years like I did. And it isn't necessarily the things I did, because I think I wasted a lot of time not knowing some of the principles in this video. Okay, let's get on with it. Okay, before you even start anything, there are two things that are really, really important for making sure you finish on your third, or at the end of your third year. Now, first one, your supervisor. I've said it time and time again on this channel, but your supervisor will ultimately dictate how successful your PhD is. So you need to be absolutely upfront with them early on, and you need to say, I want to finish my PhD on this date. And you have to get them to at least verbally agree to the point that you want to complete within that time, and do not allow them to go, well, maybe we could go a bit after. You know, they need to be as rock solid on that decision as you are, and you need to explain to them absolutely clearly why that is important for you. And the second thing is that the reason I think I got done so quickly is because I had a $20,000 payment to make at the end of my third year. I was an international student in an Australian university. I'm originally from the UK, Plymouth, whoop whoop. Plymouth, massive. The thing is that I had a fee waiver for only 3 years. And as an international student, I had to pay $20,000 if I was to go over even by 1 day. Therefore, I recommend you have a hard limit. You know, like you have an immovable time. And this comes down to something called Parkinson's law. And Parkinson's law essentially just means that any task will fill up the time you give it. If you want to finish your PhD in 4 years, you'll be able to fill it. If you want to finish it in 3 years, you can do that same amount of time and research and experiment in 3 years that you would have expanded to 4 years, because that's just our nature as humans, is to just look and go, okay, we'll space out all these things. I won't do this today. I'll do it later. Like, that is the task. So if you give yourself, 8 hours to do a task, but then you halve it. Like, I always do this to myself. I'm like, let's halve it. I go to 4 hours, and I can normally do that task in half the amount of time if I at least give myself a hard deadline. So those are the two important things you need to get set before you start anything: supervisor and a hard deadline, whether it's monetary, whether or not you're getting a job, whether or not you need to leave the country. That is the hard deadline you need at the end. Okay, year one. Here is the most important part of your PhD. It's the first few months. Now, in your first 2 months, what I recommend you do is you set your habits. You build up the habits that actually will help you. Coming in at the same time every day, leaving at a reasonable time, having a good amount of sleep at night. Now go check out my other video where I talk about the perfect PhD daily schedule, but that will essentially show you what a daily PhD should look like. And it's about sort of chunking up your time into focused work where you set your attention on one thing for an hour and a half. And you may not be able to do that initially. Like, you may only be able to manage like half an hour of attention, and that's absolutely fine. But in these first 2 months, we're building up that ability to focus and concentrate on one activity. And really early on, that one activity is reading literature. It's about trying new experimental techniques, looking deeper into the literature and research areas, but really just spending a completely focused and you turn your attention onto that thing for an hour and a half, and you do 2 of those a day. Anyway, also, if you sign up to my newsletter, you'll get a template, a daily template with task lists and to-do lists and goals and all that sort of stuff. So it's a simple printout, and go check that out. So yes, newsletter. All right. In the first 2 months, not only are you setting your habits, you're setting good habits, because those habits are the foundation to your PhD. But the second thing is you are also building relationships. You're building relationships with the key people in your lab. And you'll notice at the moment, the first 2 months, I have not done anything about literature. I've not done anything about research, like getting into the lab. Like, this is the first 2 months of laying the foundations. Now, you can read the literature, you can do those things. All of these things that I'm laying out in the roadmap is completely flexible depending on your PhD, but you'll notice that the focus is not on cramming or getting into the lab or doing stuff. It's about habits and relationships. For 2 months, build those relationships with the key people, your supervisor, your lab mates. Start asking people about their research, the people in the lab that's a bit further along, the postdocs. What are they doing? What's good? What's not good? Can they find any overlap with your research? All of that sort of stuff is important. Now, for me, I had to learn a lot of experimental techniques. I had to learn scanning electron microscope, the transmission electron microscope. I had to do atomic force microscopy, optical measurements, UV vis. Like, I had to go find the managers of those instruments, build relationships. So when I was ready to go, I want to use this, they kind of trusted me, they knew me, they understood that I was motivated. Those relationships are a big sort of help when you just need something done and people just know you and they like you. You don't have to be friends, but you can be friendly with all of these important people. But the biggest relationship in the first 2 months is your supervisor. Regular meetings, at least once a week early on. Show them what you found, show them some literature, ask them questions. In the first few months, you're not really expected to know too much other than, who to speak to solve problems, and start reading that literature. And so the first 2 months are very important, and you need to set your habits, build relationships, and then you can move on to the next stage. And the next stage in the next 4 months, that will take you up to the first 6 months, but the next 4 months really is about literature and skill building. You need to make sure that you are completely all over the literature. So go through and start deep diving. I used to have 2 piles of papers, which was like must read right away and would be nice to read. The must read right away were really important papers that were directly related to my PhD. And then as I'm reading those, I go, oh, that would be interesting to read if they quote something. And I just sort of like print that out. And today you can use, an online manager or just some folders on your computer. But then I would prioritize the must reads, which were directly related to my research. And then I would have this kind of like fuzzy boundary of my knowledge where there would be the like nice to read. And I would make sure that I would read 1 or 2 of these every day. And in the first 6 months, you just want to go through and just get a sense of what the literature is doing, what it's like, how it relates to your PhD, your question, your research question that you have to get so well defined early on, and you can sort of mold it as you go, because that's the reality of a PhD, is that you think you're starting off in one direction, but in fact another direction is far more fruitful and interesting, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the second thing you should do in the first 6 months of your PhD is skill building. So, what skills do you need to go ahead? Now, don't be like, oh, maybe I would need this. You just want the immediate skills. So for me, it was atomic force microscopy, and I just had to kind of get used to using this machine, and it takes a long time to learn to use these machines properly. I needed to become an expert in all of these different types of machines and instruments and microscopes and techniques. I used ultrasonic wands to completely create a mini emulsion of my conductive polymers in water. And yes, I needed to be an expert on all of these things very quickly. And this is where your undergraduate skills come in, which is getting information into your head and then using that information to do something physical. Getting over that learning action gap is really what this first 6 months is about, is understanding the literature, understanding the techniques in that literature, at least at in an academic way, and then starting to apply that, going to get training on those things you read about in the literature. That's the first 6 months. Now, the back 6 months of your first year, this is where it kind of gets fun and interesting. This is where you start trying out those preliminary experiments, or you start reading those things that other people have mentioned. But as a scientist, I would go and I would try to reproduce other people's work. You'll notice at the moment, I'm not focused on trying to do my own work or my own stuff or whatever it is. I really want to do research that other people has done, so that I can lay the foundations that I can kind of jump away from eventually in the second year and the third year. But initially, all I want to do is reproduce what people have done in the literature. This does a number of things, right? This makes sure that you know the techniques, that they are not lying in the literature, which is a massive issue science has. The reproducibility of these experiments is incredibly low. So you need to make sure that what you want to do actually works, and you do that by reproducing people's stuff in the lab. For me, I was using Katrina Landfester, the mini emulsion process, and I was able to qualify the fact that these things were at least achievable, So that's what I did. And then after I've kind of done a bit of reproducing, even in the first year, you can start to let your mind go, I wonder if I could try this. And I ended up with a few preliminary experiments in my first year that ended up in my thesis at the end. And those were very simple, like first year chemistry experiments. Like, what would happen if I vary the pH of this as I do it? What would happen if I vary the concentration of this key ingredient as I go? But those are very basic experiments, and they're not in the literature, but you're taking a literature experiment and you're just varying some of the sort of variables, and it means that you're just starting to get a sense of how this thing works. Where should you be focusing? What's working? And the thing is that early on in the back half of your first year, as you're starting to put those feelers out, you're going to get things wrong a lot. And that is what I encourage you to do, is try experiments because they're interesting and not because you think they'll work. The first and the sort of like first half of the second year, so the back end of the first year and the first half of the second year, yes, that's right. That is where you want to just fail as much as possible. Follow your interests. Lay the foundations by reproducing and then go, I wonder what would happen if, and you start going off in these directions. And, you use your lab book to record what you're doing. You follow experiments through to their completion. But having 2, experiments a day that you run or prepare in the morning, do it in the afternoon, you'll slowly build up a sense of what works, what doesn't work, what's interesting, importantly. And so that is probably the first year. Now that's a year's a long time, but that's how you quickly scale up from first day all the way through to your second year. Now let's have a look at the second year, because that is also a really fun time. This video is brought to you by my newsletter. Now go check it out at andrewstapleton.com.au/newsletter. Now I have got an exciting project coming up because I want to produce stuff that benefits you, the PhD students, the academics, and I've got a little project that I'm working on at the moment. I can't say too much, but it's very exciting for me, and I am going to release it first on that newsletter. And also when you sign up, the first thing you'll get within like a couple of minutes of signing up is a link to the daily schedule template, and I think that's going to be super important, so go check that out. Now let's look at year 2. Okay, year 2 is split up into sort of 6 months blocks. The first 6 months is all about learning from your first year, your preliminary experiments, and you start pushing the boundaries even more. Start trying new experiments, start looking at new frontiers, start sort of just pushing out the bubble. And the way I kind of think about this is, when you're doing an experiment, each option in front of you, each way you could take the experiment, it's like a series of doors. And I just open the doors that are the most interesting. So I open it up and there may just be nothing in there, or I may open it up and someone may smack me in the face. And I go, nope, that's not a good way to go. And so essentially you're just opening up as many of these doors as possible throughout your early stage of your PhD. You've laid the foundations in your first year. The second year, you're going through, you're opening these doors, and some of them are kind of interesting. Some of you look in, you're like, oh wow, that's a beautiful color in that room, I'll go in there. Or you open up a door and there's someone there, I don't know, vomiting on themselves, and you go, oh, no, thank you very much. So that is what I think a second year of a PhD should start as, is still just opening those doors, trying those different things, follow where you're going. And from that, I expect a few papers, a few kind of results that are publishable to kind of tumble out. These aren't world-changing papers by any means, but they're useful and interesting because you've started to explore the boundaries of what is known. And so by doing that, you can speak to your supervisor regularly. You're still having those fortnightly meetings at least. And you are just testing out and you're just trying, and you say, well, I've come across this interesting thing that I haven't seen in the literature. I'd like to publish it. You package it up in a little story, and I'll be doing a video on how to write a paper soon. And yes, that's what you do. So you still fail as much as possible. And by failing and learning and watching and listening, and these kind of things will tumble out. As long as you keep your eye out on for the interesting sort of results that you get, that is going to be very important. So that's the first 6 months of the second year of your PhD. Now, here is a very, very important principle. In the middle of your second year, or close to the middle, maybe a little bit before, you need to do a 80-20 check. And this is called the Pareto principle. Now, the Pareto principle is that about 20% of your efforts actually result in 80% of the results. Now this, even now, what I'm doing now, growing YouTube channels, growing businesses, my startup, this principle holds true for so many things. So there's 20% of your efforts at this point in your PhD that will result in about 80% of the results. And what you've got to do is you've got to identify that 20%. Now, On the flip side, there's 80% therefore of your effort that results in only 20% of the outcome. Therefore, it is this point where you need to flip that switch on efficiency and start to go, okay, what 20% of my efforts is resulting in the majority of the results? And that's where you should focus for the back half of your PhD, no doubt. That principle will save you time, it will save you effort, energy, and if you do a little bit of digging, I guarantee you that it will be obvious that you should be focusing on this part of your project, because the other 80% is resulting in good things, but it's only accounting for about 20% of your results. And results is up to, your PhD question. Which 20% of your effort is getting you closer to answering your PhD question? And that is so important. There we are. That is the number. If you take one thing away from this video, let it be that 80-20 rule, or the Pareto, that one principle. That will be the thing that dictates your success going on. And it means then that you can focus and double down on the things that are working for the back half of your second year, and that will launch you into your third year. First year of your third year, you are doubling down on what's working from the Pareto principle. And so I would recommend just doubling down on those experiments. And what you'll find is that as you're doubling down on the things that are working, more and more things are going right. You're building up momentum. And that first half of the year really is just the science that you're kind of there to do. You've spent this much time training yourself to do these experiments. Now you're forcing forward, you're forging a new path, you're pushing out on the boundaries of knowledge, and this is where a PhD really comes into its own, and a PhD student starts to become the expert. And it's through experimentation, it's through research, it's through exploring the literature, all of those things that have built up to this point, and now you're growing that knowledge bubble. And so that's the first half of year 3. It should be obvious at this point what's working, what's not, and you're just pushing forward. And the second half of the third year is where you start to flip the switch from experiments to writing up. Now you can start earlier if you want, but having a good PhD story, I like to kind of zoom out a little bit, and you only get that opportunity to zoom out and really understand what your PhD story is once you've got that expert level of knowledge and you've got that kind of body of work. That's so very important. So zoom out, get an idea, right, this is the overall, what have I achieved? And then you start sort of like doing those finishing experiments, you start tying up loose ends, and you start flipping in that sort of middle of the third year, you start flipping from experiments to writing. And it's like a gradient, at least it was for me. I was still writing, a couple of days a week, and then 3 days a week I was in the labs going, well, I'm writing up this point at the moment. I don't really feel this is a complete story. I'll just do this little experiment to tidy it up. And that's the gradient you're trying to achieve on the back end of your PhD. And yes, writing up, go check out my other video on how to write your thesis, but I've got everything you need in there. Just go check out that video because it's full of really important information about writing your PhD and finishing up faster. Once again, it's about small little improvements every single day that make you closer to your goal, and 1% every day over 3 years is going to add up to something incredible, and you'll get there, I promise. So there we have it. That is what I would do if I had to complete a PhD in 3 years. Let me know in the comments below what you would add to that. If you've had a certain experience that you want to share, I would love to hear it. And good luck. Until next time, I hope you have a fantastic day, and I shall see you in the next video.